Your top story: President Cyril Ramaphosa will today join other African leaders from Rwanda, Kenya, Senegal and the Seychelles in the outreach segment of the G7 that will focus on the ocean's economy, recognized as a very important growth pole for the country. Ramaphosa believes that his interactions with business leaders in Canada will yield some positive results for the country moving forward. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump held a media briefing before departing for a summit in Singapore with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un.
We tackled a variety of issues and opportunities facing our nations. At the top of the list was the issue of trade. Very important subject because the United States has been taken advantage of for decades and decades, and we can't do that anymore. We had extremely productive discussions on the need to have fair and reciprocal, meaning the same. People can't charge us 270% and we charge them nothing. That doesn't work anymore. I made a lot of statements having to do with clarity. We want and expect other nations to provide fair market access to American exports, and that we will take whatever steps are necessary to protect American industry and workers from unfair foreign trading practices, of which really there are many, but we're getting them straightened out, slowly but surely. We also discussed the issue of uncontrolled migration and the threat that it poses to both national security and other groups and countries and our citizens and quality of life. We're committed to addressing the migration challenge by helping migrants to remain and prosper in their own home countries.
Well, our U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Peace joins us now from the summit out in Quebec in Canada for the latest. Sherwin, good afternoon once again. We just saw Donald Trump. We actually caught the last of his questions as he was giving his closing remarks. What did he actually have to say to the G7 leaders?
Well, Donald Trump has left the summit essentially on his way to that all-important summit with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, in Singapore, while just ahead of the outreach segment of the summit that includes leaders like Cyril Ramaphosa and other developing world leaders that have been invited here. So Donald Trump will essentially not be at the table when they discuss issues of climate change, the ocean's economy, and a very important discussion in terms of the South African context, given the launch of Operation Phakisa in 2014. He talked about trade, as he mentioned in that clip. He blamed his predecessors. He said not only President Obama, but presidents who have come before them for the huge trade deficits. He also was asked a question, Alicia, about how he would rate his relationship with the other G7 leaders, and he called it a 10. Now, Donald Trump is one of the first leaders to hold a press conference before his departure, but it's going to be interesting to hear Justin Trudeau, Emmanuel Macron, Theresa May and the like agree that the relationship is a 10. I think there's huge disagreement on the trade issue. I think there are greater issues of national security that concern these leaders and cooperation on various fronts than just focusing on the one issue of trade. So it's going to be very interesting to hear what they say. There's a great deal of concern, even from President Ramaphosa, around these protectionist policies that are being instituted by the United States. If you talk to the leaders of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they say no good can come from protectionist policies. And remember, it is globalization, the very nature of open trade and open borders, that has tackled the big questions of poverty and poverty eradication around the world. So this really runs antithetically, if you will, against what the world is wanting to see from President Trump. But he is standing his ground on this. He believes that he is in the right here. He accuses his predecessors of allowing these trade deficits to get out of hand. But huge disagreement, I would say, among leaders of the G7 as I speak here to you.
All right, and Sherwin, of course, we do understand today being the last day, and of course, President Ramaphosa is still there. What can we expect from his closing remarks today?
Let's frame this discussion in the context of what Operation Phakisa is about. This is about new money and new investment for South Africa. They've recognized South Africa's almost 4,000 kilometer of oceans as a growth pole. So possible exploration in oil, minerals on the seabed. How do you develop South Africa's coastline, manufacturing, transportation of the seas? This is a new area that South Africa is hoping will create 1 million jobs by 2030, will add some $13.7 billion to the South African fiscus, to the GDP over that period. That's around 177 billion rand, Alicia. So we're not talking about pocket change here. So a very important discussion to learn from other countries that perhaps are more advanced in this. I mean, Canada, for example, is a big mining country. It is an exploratory country. They have oil rigs in the oceans. So what sort of symbiosis can be found, some synergies can be found with some of the more developed economies? In our discussion with President Ramaphosa yesterday, he also talked about the fact that this is where the money is, and we want to get some of that money home. I also then asked him, he talked about bilaterals that he's going to host with the Canadian Prime Minister, the French President, and the German Chancellor, and I immediately asked him, what about the United States? And his response was, well, we're having discussions at the G7, and then thanked me and walked off. So clearly the United States very much an outlier here, but South Africa very focused on what it can get out of the summit, even if Donald Trump is not at the table.
All right, and back to this, we discussed it earlier on, Sherwin. I mean, it's a very topical issue here in South Africa, the issue around land distribution without compensation. I mean, during the president's recent appearance in Parliament, he said that they are seeking even international advice as to how they can actually go about this in making sure that, of course, the economy is not going to suffer, and that those decisions taken are going to be in the interest of the whole country.
And very much reiterating that point, particularly in his discussions with investors in Toronto yesterday, really without being prompted. The president, very comfortable in that environment, Alicia, speaking off the cuff at times, not looking at his notes, as he addressed the issue of land expropriation without compensation. He gave the history of land dispossession in South Africa. He talked about how 80+% of the minority owned 80+% of the land, and how the majority in South Africa had been dispossessed with only about 13% of the land, and how this was an important process to reconfigure and to address. He talked about the parliamentary process that is currently underway, and he likened it to his work on the promulgation of South Africa's constitution. He talked about how there were almost 1 million submissions in terms of the new constitution, in terms of how they engaged with people with different viewpoints as to what sort of document South Africa needed to adopt. And he said a similar process to how they engaged on the Constitution will be implemented in terms of how they implement this new policy of land expropriation without compensation. He also talked about the fact that they will do it in terms of Section 25 in the Constitution, which has been there since the new Constitution was adopted over 20 years ago, and they will ensure that agricultural production and food security in particular will not be undermined. So very, very clear position from not sweeping it under the carpet, but addressing it quite directly.
Thank you so much for that sound update, showing Bryce Peace, live to us from Canada at the G7 summit.